Hello, everyone. Welcome to our class for today. This is still UM 039 Ethics course, and this is Sir E, your lecturer for these course. And for today, our discussion will be concentrating on the topic of ethics through thick and thin. Now, the world has undergone a lot of changes in the last couple of decades. You see the invention of computer, the internet, and the World Wide Web have made our existence very much independent with the people around us. Of course, not only in our locality, but more so with the bigger world around us. And these breaking down of walls of countries gave birth to what we now know as the concept of globalization. And so today we will be having our discussion divided into two. Okay, so the first discussion that we're going to have is all about globalization and its inevitable effect on humanity. And of course, the second one will be the indispensability of globalization to our faith, or how we try to look at religion from the perspective of globalization. Now, as we take a closer look at ethics, or our subject, our course in the contemporary world, we will first zero in on the inevitable effect of globalization to humanity. Okay? The consequences of it will be highlighted here, particularly the moral challenges that goes along with globalization. Also, we will discuss the indispensability of globalization to our faith and how religion is somehow adjusting and answering the demands of the global order, that with the hope that in the end, hopefully, we will be able to delineate ways how to adjust, to grapple with, and how to survive morally and ethically in the globalized world. And so we will be covering the topics here, globalization and its ethical challenges. We will be also looking at the concept of globalization and pluralism. Also, we will discuss ethics and universal values. We will also look at ethical challenges and responses of millennials and millennials to the concept of globalization. Also, we will be covering ethics and religion. We will look at the role of religion and ethics, and how, finally, we will look at how we could cope up with the challenges of globalization with the following learning objectives in mind. The first one, we will try to identify the important moral challenges of globalization. Secondly, we will try to compare response to shared moral dilemmas of baby boomers, millennials, millennials, and Generation C. Now, when you talk about baby boomers, these was the generation, okay, just after the wars. And so, since after the war, maraming mga taong namatay, governments encourage couples to have babies. And so their generation was called as the baby boomer generation. And of course, you talk about the millennials, those who are uh, 38 years old and below, or at least 16 to 38 years old at this time. And also, you have the concept of millennials. So, when you talk about the millennials, you are referring to Filipino millennials, and of course, the Generation Z, which you are a part of. And also, we'll try to distinguish ethics from religion. Number four, we'll try to understand and appreciate the role of religion in a globalized world. And lastly, we will try to construct a plan for coping with the challenges of globalization. Again, this is UM 39, and our discussion today will cover the topic of ethics through thick and thin. When I was writing this chapter of the textbook that we are using, I was not the one who was the original, who had the original idea of making this the title of the chapter. However, I somehow borrow this from the how do you call it? I somehow borrow this from the prescribed syllabus of the Commission on Higher Education, and so I borrowed the topic through the title through thick and thin, and I made it ethics through thick and thin. And so, without further ado, let's now proceed with our discussion on ethics through thick And then, in perspective, we have to understand that globalization started during the colonization era. It somehow was the starting point of how the idea of the world without borders came into place. Now, Nolte and Ing back in 2011 narrated how the voyages of Christopher Columbus, okay, the discoverer of America, and the Spanish conquest brought the world into an entirely new system of commercial, cultural, and technological exchanges. Of course, when we talk about the concept of globalization, we should all realize that we talk about economic globalization, we talk about political globalization, and we are talking about what cultural globalization and whatnot. And come to think of these people, that we speak of the concept of globalization, we have these defining technologies of globalization. We have computerization, we have satellite communication, fiber optics, and the internet. You talk about digitization of sort, say for example, the way we consume music before. Like we tend to buy cassette tapes and then CDs, and now we just download musics and even movies, and the things that we consume and buy are miniaturized, if I may say. Okay, so we talk about having a more complex desire right now to be one with the world, as human technology linked all of us to our fellows regardless of distance and time. And these interconnectedness of us to other people and our independence to them in this small world has is somehow, but it has greatly affected our values, our worldviews, and more so, it has affected our morality. There was a poll conducted by a certain organization online, and it discusses about the responses or the attitudes of people around the world towards globalization. This is an international poll conducted by internet-based market research firm YouGov. In this poll, the Philippines emerged. Look at this poll on screen right now. The Philippines emerged as the second most supportive of globalization, with 85% of respondents in the Philippines believing that globalization is actually a force for good. Filipinos becoming one of the world's biggest fans of globalization. Now, if you're going to look at yours right now, you will see that most of the countries in Southeast Asia are approving of globalization as as very helpful in the world today. But you have to, when if you are going to consider also these poll, you have to look at some of first world countries here believing that globalization is also a force for good. So you have here the countries like Sweden, Denmark, Germany, Finland, Australia, US, Great Britain, France. So these are first world countries who also believers of globalization. But if you're going to look at our continent, you will find out that most countries in Southeast Asia, with Vietnam leading the respondents, okay, saying that globalization is actually a force for good. But we have to consider that globalization in general did not only change human lifestyle, okay? But more importantly, globalization also changed, if not, it challenged our value system as international trade and cultural exchanges became swifter. Ethical and moral norms were modified, and also it was reshaped to fit in the needs of a time. So it is an understatement to say that it has become a very challenging period, okay, for all of us to stand up for the call to not compromise, okay, our moral values, our beliefs for the purpose, just for the sake of unity, just for the sake of diversity. However, we have to understand that globalization, despite of all the benefits that we can get from it or whatnot, definitely has its drawbacks. It has its disadvantages, as most of us are eagerly wanting to have more. If not, we want to be better, while Human history started simple at best. However, our wanting, our interest to always be in touch and be one with the world out there made us hungrier to get connected, to be connected with the bigger world, inclusive definitely of our exchanges of culture, of products to which we were introduced. According to John Navardine Peterse, globalization is like a prism in which major disputes over the collective human condition are now refracted. So we talk about the questions of capitalism, we say globalization did it. We talk about the concept of inequality, we say globalization did it. We speak of power, of development, ecology, culture, gender, identity, population. It all comes back to the landscape, at least according to Peter, say that all our ideas, our perspectives, our worldviews about all of these topics is a matter of how globalization influenced our perspectives on such. These statements of Peter perfectly indicates the effect of a society, since cultural exchange is very much important in this concept. We have to consider the effects of globalization on cultures of people, as culture definitely reflects our values, our morality, the morality of our society. It is only right for us to examine how the global order at the moment has aided it, how it has influenced, how it has distressed, and also how globalization damaged our moral and ethical principles. Now, we have to consider as well that the concept of globalization made us even more accepting of the concept of pluralism. Now, the possibility of pluralism is a consequence of globalization, where people champion the cause of equality, meaning regardless of your sex, regardless of your gender, regardless of your faith, we do not judge people. We try to dismiss concepts of discrimination and ethnocentrism. By ethnocentrism, we mean we try to make our own culture as the basis of all, as the basis of all other cultures. It is not an idea set in itself, but it is rather a way of posturing ourselves to the world. Now, one explicit indicate that globalization has crept in our society definitely is our overwhelming approval to the idea of pluralism. Okay. Now, when we talk about the concept of pluralism, it's not a way of judging people at face value, but we allow and we give voice to people and try to understand where they're coming from. Because at least in the concept of pluralism, the stories of people, the ways, okay, in which they live, and somehow the rationality of their actions are far more significant than what people actually think about them. Now, we talk about globalization, we also speak of pluralism, and definitely hindi natin pwedeng isantabi dito ang ating pag-aaral ng multiculturalism. When we speak of multiculturalism, this is an example of pluralism where the equally represents competing interests of the society. When we talk about multiculturalism, it champions and fosters coexistence of different cultures, different practices, different traditions. So it's like if you are living in a very multicultural community where there are a lot of representations from other cultures, we try to foster coexistence. Okay, and we thrive in diversity, to say this when we speak about the concept of pluralism. Also, when we speak about multiculturalism, it gave way to what we know as ethical pluralism. Okay, now when we talk about the concept of ethical pluralism, we have to understand that that this is very important for us to understand. Whenever we make decisions of what is right and what is wrong. And this will now lead us to the concepts of ethical monism or moral monism, the concept of ethical relativism or moral relativism, and also the concept of ethical pluralism or moral pluralism. And these are very important concepts as you try to proceed with your exams, with your major exams in these course here in UM 39. Because at least in your major exams, you will be choosing at least three moral issues at hand, which are have already sent, which I have already sent to you, and you will be laying down your cards. You will try to research on those topics, and by that you will be choosing whether you agree with the moral issues or not. But when you talk about whether you are in agreement or not, you have to choose whether you are an ethical monist, you are a relativist, or a pluralist. Now let's proceed, and let's try to understand how we try to appreciate the concepts of ethical monism, ethical relativism, and ethical pluralism. Start first with ethical monism. Now, when we speak of ethical monism, it says here that there is only one standard of truth, meaning there is an absolute standard of truth. Meaning, when we talk about the concept of morality, we say that there is only one moral thing to do. There are no other ways. Instead, there is only one way in looking at the truth. Meaning, when we say, for example, we talk about the concept of abortion, the idea of abortion. If you are an ethical monist and you say that abortion is wrong, no ifs, no buts, then you say that you are a monist. You believe that it is downright wrong. And that is being ethically or morally monist, if I may say. Ibig sabihin, pag pinag-usapan natin ang monism, naiisa lamang yung tama. Okay? We don't say that there are, how do you say this? We don't say na there this is just exclusive, okay, for some group. This truth is just exclusive for some group, but we say when we are considering ourselves to be monist, we say that this is inclusive under all circumstances. And also we talk about ethical relativism, and when we say relativism, we get the word relative, meaning there can be no right answer, since truth is very much relative from culture to culture, where we say that all ethical frameworks have some sort of validity. And so we don't judge people on the basis of what we know is the truth. Instead, we tolerate their cultures, okay, because that works for them. The key word for ethical relativism is tolerance. Okay, so say for example, we do not agree with the idea of abortion, but in other cultures they do abortion, if we may say. So we don't say it's not a matter of saying that they are wrong, but what we're trying to point out, it works for them, and so be it. So, but when you are a monist, you say even though they're from another culture, definitely they are wrong. Okay, even though you disagree with them, you don't really say that they are wrong, because at least what? Okay, it works in the concept of their culture. You might be in disagreement with them, but it doesn't necessarily follow that you do not you say that it's wrong, because definitely it works at least in their culture, because what is right and what is wrong is very much dependent on the culture of people, which leads us into the last part, which is what we call as ethical pluralism. Now, when you say ethical pluralism, we talk the plurality of moral truths. Now here, when we talk about the plurality of moral truths, meaning we try to accept that there are, or there may be, more than one correct moral framework that we can use. And so the key word in ethical pluralism is what we call acceptance. In ethical relativism, it's tolerance. However, in ethical pluralism, it's acceptance. So what's the difference between relativism and pluralism? In relativism, again, you might disagree, but it doesn't necessarily follow that you consider them wrong, because at least it works for them. But in ethical pluralism, we say that everything is right. That's when we say that in ethical pluralism, there is a plurality of moral truths. Now, when we talk about ethical pluralism, these also talks about the idea that there are diverse theories about what is morally right and what is morally wrong. And it might be incompatible or incommensurable with our own personal and cultural moral norms. Now, these concepts considers action that mirror a pluralistic approach to contextual differences. Okay, and so this will now lead us to our understanding of universal values. Okay, now when we talk about universal values, these are values that a great many human beings in the vast majority of places and situations at all times do in fact hold in common, whether consciously and explicitly or as expressed in the lives of people. We also call this as global goals because they carry much significance, since they embody a set of moral principles on which at least we can agree. Okay, now globalization also brought into light these very important aspect of ethical concern. Now, this is a vital part of our conversation, as globalization entails us to focus on universal values that would be perhaps the benchmark of our everyday dealings people. Okay, and so you see now your screen. If you're going to look at your screen right now, you will see the result of a study conducted by Kinnear. Okay, and he provided with a list of four major categories of universal moral values summarized in the chart below. So you have to understand, people, that despite the seeming attempt of universalists to come up with ideas that would help us in our interactions, there are those who still try to criticize the concept of universalism. Okay, but then again, let's try to look at these list of the four major categories of moral universal values, at least according to Kinner. The first one here is what we call as our commitment to something greater than the self. And when we talk about the commitment greater than the self, this is in recognition to the existence of and commitment to a supreme being, a higher power, a higher purpose somewhere out there. Okay, now in order to be accepting of all faith, we say that when we talk about our commitment to something greater than the self, or the recognition of a supreme being, perhaps this could be the recognition that a God or or Jesus Christ exists, or perhaps for Muslims you have Allah, and then for Buddhists you have Buddha. And the recognition of the existence of something greater than the self is very much important, but it is not just exclusive to a recognition of someone or a higher power somewhere out there, because um when you seek truth or when you seek justice, perhaps that's also a commitment to something greater than you are. Okay, it doesn't necessarily follow that when you commit you're something greater than yourself. It's just a matter of knowing that you are committed to a higher power. It could be a commitment to a higher purpose, say for example the purpose of justice, the purpose of peace, and whatnot. The second category in Kinnear's universal moral values is self respect, but with humility, self discipline, and acceptance of personal responsibility. Here we try to respect and care for ourselves. We do not abuse our health, we do not abuse ourselves, but we do not as well exalt ourselves or overindulge ourselves. We try to show humility, okay, and we try not to be selfish and self-centered, and we act in accordance to our conscience and accept the responsibility in every actions that we make. The third category in Kinnear's universal moral values is our respect and care for others. So here we see the concept of the golden rule, meaning we try to recognize the connectedness between people, since we are all social beings needing to be connected with the people around us to serve humankind and be helpful to individuals, to be caring, to be respectful, to be compassionate, to be tolerant, and somehow to be forgiving of others, to not hurt others. What is the golden rule, by the way? When we speak of the golden rule, we talk about what? Okay, the positive concept of the golden rule states that do unto others what you want others do unto you. But the negative idea of the golden rule is what? Do not do unto others what you would not want others do unto you. And that is the third major category of universal moral values. And lastly, we talk about caring for other living things and the environment. I think we all would agree that our environment has been so devastated for the longest time, and we have to step up and at least take care of the nature around us. Now, the problem, because since pluralism sees ethical principles as non-normative, it in a way questions moral truths, right? Because pluralism accepts all kinds of truths. It's in as very non-normative because it questions absolute moral truth. It questions the idea na isa lamang ang tama, because the concept of pluralism states that lahat ay tama. This is then becoming more and more problematic because moral absolutes are being invoked by religion. Say you talk about a church, which is the mouthpiece of the moral truths, the social conscience of the society, affirms the moral absoluteness of an act, which are assumed to reflect, of course, how we deal with people all the time. Another problem of pluralism as a product of multiculturalism is that it downplays a continual dialogue between subcultures and larger cultures and the ways that these dialogue inescapably defines us. Now, the distinctiveness of subcultures and minority groups is not being protected by pluralism. Instead, it could promote the dominant culture. In the global world, the dominant culture is what we follow, which can lead to what? What we call as oppressive imperialism. The question of who dictates the house of the global world is very much dependent on the question, who's the powerful, or who is influential. Now, as the global community grows, most individual cultures are being diluted. Say, for example, you talk about the dilution of subcultures, and nation states somehow need to step up so that we could prevent the weakening of the individual cultures of people by foreign content, by foreign media content, and to counter influences in their domestic moral values and beliefs. Okay, so these are some of the repercussions of embracing pluralism for all it is. Now, let's talk about the ethical challenges and response, in particular, how millennials and millennials view these. Now, when we talk about millennials, again, we are referring to Filipino millennials. Now, globalization somehow furthered the gap between generations. The moral convictions and ways of dealing with moral dilemmas were faced differently by different generations. I had this conversation with a father of a student one time, and he was telling me this. Sabi niya, alam mo, sir, noong hindi pa nag-aaral sa kolehiyo ang anak ko, when my son was not yet enrolled in college, every time I say something, oo lang ng oo yan. But right now, nakita ko that every time I say something, lagi siyang merong sasabihin na hindi naman ganun yon. And somehow I tried to console the father, and I told him, sir, you have to understand that our influences right now of how we view truth is very much different. But it is very important that you try to understand where your son is coming from as well. So as you'll be able to at least know, Okay, how to adjust with it and how to somehow answer to how the current system of the world is influencing the worldviews of your son. And that is very important as we move along with our discussion. In a survey conducted by Pew Research Center, this is in the US, it was revealed that those who are ages 18 to 29 were more likely to report lifestyle agreements, views on family, you talk about relationships and dating, while older people revealed differences in a sense of entitlement. Those in the middle age groups also often pointed to a difference in manners. So you see how the way we deport ourselves are very much different from generations to generation. Father Armand Robeza explains that when you talk about the Filipino millennials these days, he said that most Filipino millennials are open to seeking opportunities. Would it be um, uh, may it be like perhaps studying or working abroad and whatnot. And most of them demand flexible work schedules. They value work life balance as supported in the findings of the Department of Labor and Employment, which found fresh graduates to be very much picky. In the study of Rableza, he also found out that most Filipino millennials are hardworking, ambitious. This I can see. Actually, and definitely virtually connected. However, if we're going to talk about um, Filipino American millennials. Okay, if we're going to discuss about Filipino American millennials, they are not into traditional institutions like politics and religion, and they're not obsessed with traditional customs like getting married or owning a house or whatnot. Perhaps due to the fact that they are culturally distinct, they are way different from Filipino millennials anymore. They are a special subculture since they are Filipinos by heritage, but they are not able to speak our language anymore, giving them a hard time, giving them a very difficult time to access their racial culture. With this in mind, we have to understand that they have more first world influences as they have become part of the global dominant culture. As for millennials, okay, they are more used to experiencing ethical and moral differences by virtue of the content, perhaps of the media content that we are given every day by virtue of internet. So we have a lot of influences right now. That's the reason why a lot of millennials are very much more used to experiencing moral differences and whatnot. So it's very important that we try to at least settle these issue if necessary, which leads us now to our discussion on ethics and religion. Now, our colonizers somehow forced on us to accept their culture. And when we talk about these colonizers forcing us to accept their cultures, definitely this is inclusive of their religion, of their faith. Since religion is a big part of our culture, our values are very much influenced by our belief in the supernatural and, okay, in everything that is related to it. On your screen right now, you will see how the world is divided according to adherents of religion. This is a 2015 infographic, the source of which is the Pew Research Center. Okay, in the U.S. So you see here, there are still majority Christians around the world, and when you talk about religions, we are Christians here. We are referring to all Christian denominations and whatnot. So you have the Muslims, the Hindus, and even those who are unaffiliated. And when we say unaffiliated, these are people who do not adhere to any form of religion at all. Now, in an age where humanity, people give less and less interest and value to religion, somehow the once powerful and seemingly indispensable agent of world order, and here I am referring to religion, is facing one of the greatest of its greatest threat in all of its history. because as the secularization theory would suggest, religion right now in the process of globalization is slowly becoming an insignificant facet in the globalized world with the advances of science and of course industrial society. Religion has been scrutinized, if not vilified, in a globalized world. Religious traditions seem to fade into the background of globalization as the significance of religion is being tested, if not questioned. Look here on screen right now, and you will see our globe and how this has divided our world in particular. Okay, so you will see here the global distribution of Christianity, of Buddhism, of folk religions. When we talk about folk religions, perhaps it would be inclusive of animism. Of course, you have Hinduism, the Jews. Of course, when you talk about Judaism, this is a very special kind of religion because it is not for everyone. It's only for the Jews who could be included in Judaism. Of course, you have the Muslim faith. And again, as I said a while ago, you talk about those who consider themselves unaffiliated. However, there is a challenge to religion in the global order. Runzo, okay, highlighted that since the adaptation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or the UDHR, there already has been an avoidance of religious discussion, of religious perspectives, because, again, when we talk about religion, it is very much monist, to say the least. They believe that there is only one truth. That's the reason why there has been an avoidance of religious perspectives because of its exclusive nature, and perhaps because of the constitutional provisions in many countries of what we call as the separation of the church and the state. Now, in the context um, of the say the separation of the church and the state in the Constitution of the Philippines, we have to look at it in perspective because historically there has never been a separation of the church state of the church and the state in the Philippines. Yes, we do have what we call as the separation of the state on paper, but never in practice, and that is something that we have to consider. Okay, now the universalization of individual human freedom, which is now a part of the international agreement between nation states, averts religious invocations. Okay, as the latter seemingly divides rather than it unites human beings. So there's a tendency for people to think that instead of uniting people, religion historically has been dividing man ever since. But of course, religion has definitely its response to it. Now, the secularization of human rights somehow disdains moral and religious doctrines. Nevertheless, since religious beliefs are normative because it is very monist and that it believes that there is only one truth. Nevertheless, if you're going to look at that, it would go against the global pluralistic order. Okay, when you speak of plurality, it's all about equality, it's all about acceptance, and it speaks of religious non-discrimination. If we are to go back to the list of universal moral values by Kinnear, which we discussed a while ago, what is certain for universalists is that religious traditions, religious practices, and whatnot transgress human rights principles that should be bestowed to all humanity. Now, here, the question would be, is it true that religion divides more than it unites humanity? And that is a question that we try to answer, to say the least. Thomas in 2015 argues that the power of religion was being dismissed by the relentless secular theory of international relations. And when you are relating with other people, if you are in a globalized world, you have to understand where these people are coming from. You cannot be discriminatory of whatever their faith is or whatever their faiths are or whether they have faith or not. And so we have to understand that at least religion somehow is quote unquote being dismissed in the globalized world. Okay, this is somehow evidenced, Okay, particularly after September 11 attack, the worst day of terrorism in history, okay, of the world, not only in the US, as it posed questions to the globalized world about our religious differences. Now, how do we first demarcate or differentiate the concepts of ethics and religion? Now, when we talk about ethics, of course, we say that ethics is actually in reference to the moral philosophical concept, okay, to the philosophical concept of morality. However, when we talk about religion, it is a symbolic system that gives identity out of a social that identity to a person who is adhering to that particular religious tradition. When we speak of ethics, it tries to help us understand moral concepts and justify moral principles by using our reasonability, if I may say. Okay. However, when we talk about religion, this is considered as our sensitivity to the ultimate meaning of existence. Because again, we cannot do away with the concept of Christianity when we talk about the ultimate meaning of existence, or the concept of faith or religion, to be inclusive to all about it. Because when you talk about the ultimate meaning of existence, religion has its answer to it. And definitely, this springs from our relationship to a transcendent reality, to a higher being, to a being is totally other than us. And when we talk about ethics, it analyzes concepts such as right and wrong. That's the reason why we're studying right now with the concept of right and wrong ethics. And it seeks to establish principles of right behavior that may serve as guides to action for people to follow. So that's what ethics is all about. Now, when we talk about religion, though usually considered as the concept of inner spirituality, this sensitivity, okay, to the supreme being, to the transcendent reality, should in a way radiate in man's daily interaction with the people around them. So this is where we try to delineate or to understand the difference between ethics and religion. Now, as the religious domain remains to be multidimensional. So when we talk about the multidimensionality of religion, we say that religion is associational in that we try to associate with the people of our same faith. It's communal in a way that we go to church to commune with the higher power, with the supreme being, with the other people who believe in that supreme being. And it's also very much doctrinal in that we learn a lot of dogmas, traditions, and beliefs, okay, that we try to apply to our life and in our life. And also, it's very much devotional because you try to devote yourself to that particular religious belief. Okay, now religious responses in global moral issues are necessarily normative because again, religion is a very monist concept. While we must acknowledge the modern day desire for a say neutral and universal standards of norms, you have to understand that when you talk about religion, neutrality is an impossibility because again religious beliefs is very normative, meaning it is very monist. It is in this way that it asserts convictions which cannot be compromised. Thus we have to understand that it is inescapable still to invoke religious wisdom in moral and ethical issues despite the present world's clamor perhaps for universalism. Okay, but definitely religion as of this moment has to make a way in order to make sure that the world right now at present will try to understand where it's coming from and what the beliefs of these different faiths are. So how do we cope with the challenges of globalization? Because again, we know that globalization brought forth a liberalization, a very much independent concept of our ethical and moral standards. This also challenged our way of confronting ethical and moral dilemmas. Truth be told, there is by no chance that we can escape from the effects of globalization anytime soon. As its effects are here to stay, it is very important that we, particularly youngsters of these time will be able to cope up with the current system of globalization. According to Faye, the best way to survive globalization, okay, is to understand our own cultural self awareness. Again, according to Faye, the best way to survive this time is to understand our own cultural self awareness. And when we talk about this cultural self awareness, we are referring to three possibilities. Okay, how do we do that? First one, people should comprehend their history, its evolution, distinctive features, and future trends, so as not to be so as not to be swallowed by the current dominant culture. We should understand our history. We should understand our evolution, who we are, what our purpose is as a nation. Okay. The second one is that millennials and global generation Z should also thoughtfully and cautiously consider how they live their lives in the virtual world. Meaning, you have to understand that there is a responsibility in in saying out loud your and airing out everything, okay, that your heart desires. And also you have to consider how you try to present yourself in the real world. You have to understand that still, even though you are living in a very globalized world, in a globalized culture, you have to understand that you have your own what feature as an individual. You are Filipino, and that by it comes the traditions, the norms that we imbibe as a people, and whatnot. And lastly, people living with a specific culture should come to know themselves. Again, for this, so as not to be swallowed by the current global dominant culture. With this, we will be able to make cultural choices and adjustments to new environments and special times. It is significant that we are aware, okay, yet we are deeply rooted in who we are. We are grounded in our moral principles, we are grounded in our ethical principles. However, it is also important that we do not make judgments, that we are not prejudiced on those who have lived most, if not all of their lives, okay, away from the singularity of the world. Meaning, we're talking about perhaps the baby boomers, your parents, and whatnot, whose influence is very much um, inclusive of the culture that they grew up with. You have to understand that your generation grew up differently from how your parents grew up, and the influences in their worldview, in their perspectives, is very much different from yours. And so there has to be a dialogue between you and your parents in order for you to understand each other. Okay, this is very much important, and we must appreciate and recognize how they have contributed to who and what we are now as a global community. Now, remember, these people that living in a pluralistic world undeniably poses a lot of challenges, threats, if not opportunities to our moral consciousness. Understanding who we are is important. And the diverse human culture in this ever changing small world devoid of walls will consent us to coexist in peace with other people, and somehow we try to work together for the development towards a much progressive society for all humanity. Listen, everyone, globalization has exposed humanity, all of us, to challenge our belief system. And if I may, challenging your belief system is just okay, because that's when you try to realize whether that belief system is worth holding on, if that belief system is worth embracing. As the world, as the global order is here to stay, so is our need to interpret and reinterpret the current system of the world with all of its struggles, all of its problems, and all of its dilemmas to our generations at the moment, okay, and even to the previous generations. Truth be told, it would be impossible to interpret human affairs, although also in the global order, without invoking our faith, particularly as Filipinos. This is not to say that we do not accept We do not try to understand people coming from different faiths or those who are not even affiliated to any sort of faith. But we have to understand that at least the our belief, our idea of a higher power, a supreme being whom we call God somewhere out there, is very much important in how we make decisions, in how we make moral decisions. Because as globalized as we are, religious interpretations of moral and ethical issues could be very helpful in understanding the frailties and the strengths of humanity. And that wraps up our discussion of ethics through thick and thin. This is Sir E signing off, and thank you very much. I hope you learned a lot from our lesson today. This is YUM 39 Ethics, and again, this is your topic, ethics through thick and thin.